MCI's made some substantial breakthroughs in the technology, but it's not just technology that needs the breakthroughs, it's actually the economics. So what we've done is we've shown a way, without a carbon price, that we could be creating value from CO2 by using it as a resource. Climate change needs lots of solutions. 14 years ago, when my founder John Beaver and myself started out on this journey, we looked at what could we possibly do with CO2. We found a natural earth process, which is weathering. The rain hits the rock and is absorbed into the rock in a small amount. And what we're doing is speeding that process up into a matter of hours rather than over 1 million years that it might take to absorb a large amount of CO2. We looked at that process, we've sped that process up in our own research labs, and now we're scaling that technology so that it can be put into industry, so they can take their CO2 emissions and absorb it into these minerals. This process of mineral carbonation is a sped up natural process, but has the capability of addressing climate change in a substantial way. Mineral carbonation is the process of transforming minerals into carbonates. And so what we do is we take magnesium silicates, calcium silicates, and convert them into magnesium carbonates and silica. So there's two products that we produce, and they can be used in industry. So mineral carbonation is what's called exothermic, which means when we do the reaction, it creates energy. So we don't need energy on the way in for it to be favourable for our process to happen. This is significant because it means the heat we create from doing the reaction can be used beneficially within our own process to make the process more efficient. The challenge with mineral carbonation with many processes is what's called the kinetics. The kinetics is making the process happen in a reasonable amount of time and to make that valuable to produce the materials. We know that CO2 emissions are our problem and that we need to be capturing those and decarbonising, but it's strange at the moment that there is not a lot of CO2 actually captured, and we need to do carbon capture, utilisation, storage and those solutions. The thing about the CO2 that we use is that it has been available for quite a long time because our industrial partner Orica has captured its CO2 for many years. So we've taken that CO2 as our first CO2 into our plant and processed it to create the new materials, showing a pathway, an industrial pathway and a valuable pathway for new products. Mineral carbonation could be used in many different scenarios, and so what we're looking for are places like industrial settings with steel or cement or chemical processes, or even electric generators that are still using fossil fuels that are being replaced by renewables. So they have large amounts of CO2, and what we're looking at doing is putting a plant, one of our plants, near their industrial facility. We'd be capturing their CO2, and then what we do is we react it with either their wastes. They might have some steel slag, or they might have some cement ash, or some remnants of minerals around in stockpiles, and we absorb that and then create these new materials. It's a new industrial process that employs people, it employs engineers and geologists and material scientists, and so we're looking at rolling these kinds of plants out around the world that would then help us reduce our emissions but also create new industries and value. There are enough mineral resources in the world, both wastes and through low-grade minerals in quarries around the world, that could lock away the CO2 from all industrial emissions. Just one place in New South Wales that we've looked at, our geologists have looked at, can store away 7,000 years of our emissions in Australia. Significantly at MCI we've built different materials, and this is one of our flagship materials. It's a plasterboard. It has negative emissions, and in fact 50% of this is made from CO2 emissions. It can substitute against high carbon materials in plasterboards and make a significant difference to industry and decarbonisation. All of the materials that MCI is producing are backed by a life cycle analysis, and this is pretty important because a lot of the time when you're creating materials you may be producing more CO2 than you're actually absorbing. We do a lot of techno-economic models with our materials and with our processes. So when a customer comes to us and says, can you get rid of our CO2? Can you produce valuable materials from this? And then would that make money for us? What we do is we look at the science, the technology, the economics. We then look at how much carbon is embodied in the materials, what the net cost, how much carbon is avoided. And for something like this, which is our negative emissions plasterboard, this has more CO2 embodied in it than is actually created in the process of doing it. So if we then put this into industry, so we, instead of your plasterboard in your school being made out of gypsum, if it was made out of ours, then you've got a low carbon emission profile on that, which is substantial because it's embodied the carbon that's been captured and then it's substituting for something that is otherwise high carbon. Scaling a technology is not simple. It's not just about science, and in fact it's taking science out of the lab and it's pushing it into industry and seeing what industry requirements there are. So what we did was we formulated 14 different strands of research that individually had people working on those projects. Now each of those strands could either reduce the cost of our process, improve the process, test further processes, but then also increase the value of the products. So when you're thinking about translating something from the lab into real world, you need to think about the economics, because the economics are, in the end, what will drive a technology solution. Now in the longer term, we will be taking CO2 from places like chemical plants, from fossil fuel generators that are being phased out, from hydrogen production, and from atmosphere, direct air capture. We're very excited by the opportunity for the transformation of CO2 from industry and the decarbonisation pathways. The big concept here is that negative emissions technologies are required in the future, where we're drawing down CO2 out of the atmosphere, out of the environment, and putting it away safely. And so direct air capture is an emerging technology. There are many companies around the world working on this, and we're designing our technology to fit with that. They're the capture and we're the sink. We can sink that CO2 permanently away and safely. Our original grant for our technology we got 7 years ago from the New South Wales government, who pledged $3 million towards our project. We then matched that with the federal government for another $3 million and then another final $3 million from an industry partner. But all up, we've spent around $20 million in developing our global reference pilot plant. And this technology is now the world-leading technology for mineral carbonation and a large-scale solution to CO2 storage, abatement and utilisation. It takes 20 years to develop a technology, and this is counterintuitive. We see technologies emerging all the time and we think they've just emerged, but everything that we're using now is developed in the lab 20 years ago. So we're 13 or 14 years into our journey now and we still have some way to go. Scaling technology is really, really important, but it requires industry, it requires a social license, it requires government support, and we're well on the way to developing our technology to make a difference.